Query monitor workload profiles. The workload profiles are available from option 8, work with profiles. On this system, I have multiple profiles. The purpose of the monitoring profile is basically three things. One is to define workloads for exceptions and alert processing. By default, nothing is included in the collection. The monitoring profile also activates the current activity display, and in addition, you can include and exclude SQL workloads from summary data collection. So you can exclude workload that you are not interested in and include the workload that you are. You can have multiple workload profiles within a single profile. They are processed sequentially from the top down. So on the screen right now, you see an example where there are 7 workloads and they are processed top down. And Query Monitor will select the first one that matches the criteria. So let's look at, for instance, the distributed workload. At the top of the screen, we have the workload filtering. This is where you specify the identifiers for this workload. Having include here means that the workload is included for current activity, exception, and alert processing. If you have exclude here, it will be excluded for current activity, alerts, and exception processing. If you have exclude, then you can additionally disable the summary reporting. And that means that no data is collected at all. You can select whether you want to gather host variables for this particular workload for exceptions and alerts. And then finally, there's the actual identification of the workload. So you can specify subsystem, plan, package, auth ID, job names, correlation ID, etc., etc. In this case, this is my distributed workload. So I have plan name equal to distserv. I could also, for instance, have a connection ID of DRDA for same kind of identification. These attributes are ANDed together. So you can, if you specify multiple, that's a further restriction. Then we have an section with the exceptions. So you specify the exception limit. In this case, it's set to 1000. Note that if you set this to 0, then no exceptions will be collected. The first section here is the static threshold for exceptions. So based on static thresholds for CPU, elapsed times, get pages, and SQL calls. Then we have the adaptive threshold section, anomaly based exceptions. You can turn these on and off for CPU, elapsed, and get pages, and the toleration level is how many standard deviations away from the average that should trigger an exception. You can generate exceptions for negative SQL codes. My recommendation is to turn that on. However, for some exception codes, you will generate a lot of those. So you can either specifically include those that you're interested in or exclude those that you're not interested in. So for instance, if you have a lot of -803s or -811 on your system, you can exclude those. Alternatively, if you're only interested in the SQL codes for exceptions like -180, you can turn that on. We have a section for alerts with similar type of thresholds as you have for exceptions. Then we have the discard above. This is related to the adaptive threshold, so you can discard outliers in order not to change the rolling average too much. So these are excluded from the rolling average, but will still trigger exceptions if they are 12 standard deviations away from normal. And then finally we have for summaries, whether you want to filter on the SQL codes that are collected, either include specific SQL codes or exclude specific SQL codes. Additionally, you can also collect positive SQL codes if needed. For some customers, a +100 is a problem. And then we have the section with the up keys. The up keys have a major effect on the amount of data being collected. For each up key you turn on, the amount of data being collected increases, and in worst case it increases exponentially. So be judicious with your up keys. In the CQM parameter file, there are default up keys, but you can override these at the workload level. This is my recommendation that you do this. So this specific workload profile is for distributed workload. So I obviously want to have the dynamic SQL text collected because this is, exclusively dynamic SQL text. If you have an application that is not well written and they use a lot of literals rather than host parameters, you can also turn on p-text. Do note that Db2 actually also have an option to do this for you automatically. Since this is a distributed OLTP workload, I don't care about the auth ID. This will be some kind of system use ID. However, I am interested in the workstation transaction name. Some distributed applications set this in the connections, and so you can drill down by transaction name. And then finally, if you have stored procedures, I would recommend turning on the up keys for stored procedures. And so these up keys will vary by workload. So you might have a CICS workload. For CICS workload, I would recommend turning on correlation name because that's that will map to the CICS transaction name. Similarly, if you're using IMS-TM, use the correlation name. For a batch workload, you would probably want to have the up keys for the job name turned on, so you can drill down by the batch job name. If you have sort of analytics workload, you may want to turn on up keys for auth IDs, so you can drill down by use ID, etc., etc. So make some careful decisions on which up keys to turn on. If you have too many up keys turned on, you will be collecting too much data, and you will see bad response times in the ISPF UI when users are navigating the performance data because there's simply too much data being collected. Do note that for exceptions and alerts, all of the up keys are always collected. So if an SQL statement trigger an exception or an alert, all of the up keys are collected for that specific statement. So there's no need to turn on auth ID just because you want to see the auth ID for long-running SQL statements, because you can just configure an exception, and for that long-running SQL statement, the auth ID will automatically be logged. And then finally, we have miscellaneous collection options. So you can collect object data. Again, there's a collector level parameter in the parameter file where this is turned on and off, but you can turn it on and off for specific workloads as well. Collecting object data can be very useful, for instance, for a distributed workload where you don't have any packages to look at. Do note that when you turn on object data, we will have a hook into each get page. And so for get page intensive workloads, this hook is driven many times and can cause additional overhead. And then finally, you can turn on and off static and dynamic SQL collection if you want to. So I've navigated back to my monitoring profile. As you can see, I have 7 workloads. And the idea here is for each of these types of workload, I will have different thresholds for my exceptions and alerts. For instance, for my CICS transactional workload, the thresholds for exception will be much lower than the thresholds for my reporting workload or my QMF workload, because you would expect to have long-running SQL statements for those type of workloads. Also, the up keys will be different for each workload. As mentioned, for CICS, I want to have the transaction name. For my distributed workload, I want to have the workstation transaction name. For reporting and QMF, I want to have use IDs. For batch, I want to have job name. For the DSN workload, like DSN Tab2 or Spoofy or utilities, I want to have the use ID. And then at the end, I have the catch-all workload with asterisks for all filters to pick up any workload that's not does not match any of the other categories, and then have some reasonable defaults there. Once you change a workload, you can dynamically change and activate these either through the ISPF panel using option 6. You can change the profile name, or you can refresh a profile name. There are additionally also MVS modify commands where you can change the profile and refresh the profile for your collector.